Hi! Welcome to another episode of the Book Historia Bookshelf Tour du Jour. I am your friendly neighborhood pink-haired book historian and rare book cataloger, Allie Alvis, and these are my books. I collect rare books and really too many 20th century books as well. But today I will continue showing you some of my favorites, some new acquisitions, and some really weird titles. So here we go! First of all, let's see what we are looking at. So today we are going to look at this thing, this most horrible, wonderful thing. You have many questions, as do I, and I hope to answer some of them. We will also be talking about this little guy here, and this rather humble looking book here. Alright, so before we get to this, you will note that I am handling these books with bare hands. That is because gloves reduce your manual dexterity and tactility and make you more likely to accidentally damage a book. The only exception generally is when you're handling books with metal components, because any sort of residue on your hands can cause a reaction with metal. But for reasons that will become clear shortly, I'm not using gloves with this thing here. You will also note these nice little foam wedges, which are recycled from a library. These are common sights in reading rooms. They are used to support the boards of a book so it doesn't just flop open flat. This is a terrific example of when to use supports like this, because I don't know if you can, yeah, that's pretty obvious. There's a lot going on with this spine. This should be flat. This should be a straight line here. And instead it's got this really crazy indentation, which means that the leather back here it's kind of like a trampoline currently. There's absolutely nothing that it's stuck to. I don't know if you can hear that. It sounds a little bit like a drum. But if I were to let this flop open flat, that would do a lot of damage. So here we are with our wedges. Okay, so first off, the elephant in the room, what is this? You may have seen my video on treasure bindings, metal furniture. This is not that. It is in a way, but it's not medieval. This is not in any way original to this book. This is a bauble from, I think, the 1960s. That someone glued to the cover of this old French Bible. So this Bible is a wonderful example of a well-loved book. This has been used and used and used and used since it was printed in 1712. So it has had quite a life. I think the binding itself is original to the Bible, with the addition of this thing. But this just sort of goes to show you, again, like the books in my previous video, that people still treasure their old books, even to the extent of doing whatever they have done to this. But this is not, to make fun of the book or anything like that. I think it is just a display that the owners thought this book was precious enough to make pretty like this. Probably to emulate the style of a treasure binding with the materials that they had around at the time, which were 1960s baubles featuring plastic pearls and glass or paste gems. It's quite a thing. So this this I purchased on eBay, like many of my books, because I am not made of money and I have a lot of free time in the evenings. So I search antique book on eBay and wade through the pages and pages of nonsense, and sometimes you come across weird stuff like this. But I am not making faces about this book just because of this lovely edition. I must say that this is probably one of the yuckiest books I own. And that is as a result of being used since 1712. I mentioned in my last video finding fingernails in the gutters of old books, and that was speaking from experience with this book. I regret to inform you that there are human fingernails in here. It's disgusting, but it's also fascinating. There are all sorts of projects going on at libraries, like the Folger Shakespeare Library, Project Dust Bunny, it's called, to try and pull information from the crud that ends up in the gutters of old books, especially big ones like this. So let's get to it. Actually, I'm going to grab another bit of foam to support this just because it's so weird. Immediately we come to these end leaves, which have all sorts of owner names on them. There's this thing, which I think is another owner name. Hold that up to the camera. And boy, I don't know if I want to pick this up. This is a heavy and awkward book in bad condition. But I will give it a shot. Maybe I can do this so it's not actually causing any injury to the thing. Here we go. So you can see what I mean when I say yucky. It's just, you know, it's got these stains, it's got ownership marks, which are cool, but it's just used. Like, this is a well-used book. So even when you get past the end leaves, you get more stuff. Like there's more ownership marks here. There's an inscription dated 1815. It's just the stuff in here is so cool and interesting. More ownership inscriptions, this time in pencil by a child, which we always love to see. And this is the Sacred Bible with the New Testament, and also the Old Testament. Yeah, it's from Geneva, and it's a pretty run-of-the-mill Bible. It's not weird in any way in terms of the text, and you will see that for a lot of the books I own. I don't really buy them for the text. I buy them for the general milieu in which they exist as objects. And like, again, so this is a cool feature that you see sometimes on old books. And wow, there's even yucky stuff in this spine hole. Can you see me? I don't know. I can see you. But so, oh, this book is so weird. But you can see that the corners here are kind of round, and that's because they've been thumbed. People have read this for 300 years. And just the paper has sort of naturally worn away in the corners. They're not as sharp as they used to be. And you can see that moving through the text of the book, that it's thumbed, as we say in the trade. And for me, that's not a negative thing. A lot of times it's thumbed is a nice way of saying that the book has wear. But for me, the wear is part of the appeal. I'll try to open this up to an opening that's not quite so horribly yucky. Let's put this down, and ta-da! Of course I open up to a smashed bug. That is just so par for the course with this book. Boy, I'll have to bookmark this and come back to it, because I haven't seen this smashed bug before. I've gone through this book, I think, twice, page by page, just because it's so weird. And I didn't see this bug. There's a spider in here. There's a fly. I don't know what this is. Ew, I don't know what this is. I'll bookmark this, and I will splice in an image of this. And maybe you can tell me what this is. Some sort of mystery 18th century creature that was smushed in here. Just every single, oh God, opening is so gross. It makes me think, like, did these people read this book outside, like sitting in the grass under a tree? But there are also like these soot marks in the opening here. You can kind of see a darkness on a couple of these pages. That is from probably the wick of a candle falling into the book as it was being read, or even just like a bit of particulate from a candle falling in. And again, that's something that you often find in books like this. And it's wild to think of, you know, me sitting here with my electric lights, and I have my video lighting and with my camera. And the original people reading this were reading by candlelight, and you know, that's all they had. So it's wild to think that this is now here on YouTube. I wonder what the original French owners would think. Trying to this has also got your telltale signs of bookworm, although if a bookworm ate all the way through this, it would be a very fat bookworm. There is a bookmark in here somewhere. And I don't know if you can see like the texture of this paper as I'm going through. It's like floppy. And that's another sign that it was used a lot. It's not, you know, stiff and crunchy and new. It's floppy and loved. You know, like a used novel that you would find in a charity shop or something. This is handmade paper. It's probably made of linen rag paper. And if you hold it up to the light, you can often see chain lines. So the way paper was made in this period, and really up until the 19th century, sort of mid-19th century, was on these large sort of screen doors. The papermaker would put a bunch of slurry into a big vat. The slurry is actually called the stuff. And they would scoop in this mesh, it looks like a screen door, like I said, and shake it out, and the stuff would settle and the water would drip out the bottom, and then that would be lifted off and sort of placed and dried. But that means that this paper has a texture sort of like a worn dollar bill. And newer paper would have a texture like, you know, a crisp one that you just got from the bank. But this paper, it wears like a dollar bill, which means that it's pretty hardy because of that linen content. I'm not sure if they would have cotton content in here at this point. It really depends on the source of the rags. Rag recycling was a pretty big business in this period. You may remember from Christmas Carol when Scrooge's curtains and drapes end up being sold by his servants who always hated him because he was mean. And those curtains and drapes would probably end up in paper or as some sort of pulp. So interesting to see those connections. And there's just crud in all of these openings. It's so gross and so cool. I'll put in some images, some nice macros of this crud. And I will also show you that bookmark that I cannot find. The wear gets sort of worse as you get to the back. I think this final gathering is just totally loose. Ta-da! Oh God, crud came off. But I'm glad that it stuck with it. Sometimes you lose loose gatherings, but again, this is evidence that whoever, the family that had this book, treasured it. They wanted to make sure that it stayed together, even if they couldn't quite repair the thing as it was meant to be. And it's got some nice musical annotation. It's much easier to hold these up, actually, as an example of handmade paper and just the sort of general aesthetic of this book, because they don't weigh however much this book weighs, and they're not quite falling apart to the same extent. But that's not all I have to say about this book, but that's all I have to say about this book today. Again, bought it on eBay. It's just weird and I love it. And it is, as they say, a conversation piece. All right, so for our next book, this may be a familiar face. I talked about it in the book anatomy video. It doesn't really look like a book when you hold it like this. It looks like a little pamphlet or something. But this is actually how one would purchase books up until really the mid-19th century, and some places it continued further. They wouldn't have a permanent binding. They would be in wrappers like this. Bound in blues is a term that people use because the paper for the wrappers, again, this is made from rags and it's unbleached. So this would probably be made from rags that were less than white, things that had some sort of dye on them. And they wouldn't make good page paper, but you could make thicker wrappers out of them. And you can, I'll hold it up to my microphone. It's a bit crinklier than your average page because it is a bit thicker, and it functions as a binding until the buyer could take it to be bound. So when you went into a bookstore, you would buy something like this. And you, the book buyer, if you were a rich person in a stately home, could take this to your personal binder and have it bound in full leather with a red spine label and your coat of arms and what have you. But if you were a student or someone with less means, you might just keep it in its wrapper because it functions. It does have a structure. You can see these little nubbins back here are the really integral part of the structure. And you can see the very sort of way the book was put together here. The stacks of gatherings that make up the pages of the book, which is why I bought this. It's an interesting illustration of the way that books were purchased in the past and also structure. So this is, I think, this is tome 23 of a set of who knows how many. A lot of the books I have are odd volumes because they're cheaper to buy that way. But this is from... Gotta love Roman numerals. You always have to kind of do calculations in your head before you say them. So we have 15, 16, 17, 25. This is from 1725. And it even has, I think it's a shelf mark here in the bottom. I don't think it's an ownership mark. Possibly a bookseller's mark. But it's a pretty straightforward library, ancient and modern. It's a little reader. It's a little French reader from the 1700s. And there's not really a lot to say about this book other than, its sort of unfinished state. Another example of how it's unfinished are these rough edges here. I mentioned the big screen door, the frame that you use to make handmade paper. And when you pull those sheets off the frame, the edges they're not completely straight. They are what are called decal, and that is from a part of the actual frame that is used to make paper. So we call these decal edges. And you can see when you open the book, not all the pages are like the same size. And so when this book would be bound, the binder would cut off these uneven edges at the top, the foredge, and the tail here, and make a nice sort of clean book made of right angles. But for now, they're still unfinished. And this is how it's been for 300 years. Almost. Got 4 years or so until it's 300 years old. But yeah, it's a nice little illustration of book history and the way that people kept books. Now, this next book is gorgeous. This is a relatively new acquisition for me. I was actually cataloging it at the antiquarian book dealer Type Punch Matrix where I work. And this happens sometimes. I've been reassured by book dealers that you're cataloging along, and the more you look at something, the more you can't put it down. And that definitely happened to me. So I bought this from my job, and it is my first cartonnage binding. Cartonnage was a decorative French, usually French material, that was actually pretty cheap. This is a budget binding despite its beauty. It's just paper. It's like embossed and has some gilt to it. But it was much cheaper than your average run-of-the-mill leather binding. Cartonnage bindings come in all sorts of beautiful pastel colors and all sorts of ornamentation, but these sort of darker ones you don't see quite as often. And this was a book for a young adult or, an older child. It is moralizing stories for children, how to be a good person in French, with these nice little engravings. I love these. And this dates to 1846. So this was really the height of the cartonnage style in France. And when you get a whole bunch of these together on the shelf, they're incredible. And unfortunately, again, there's not a lot written in this book. There is a nice little inscription here dated 1857. So this was probably a gift to a child. And it has these, you might recognize this illustration actually. I did use it in my video about, I think it was marginalia. But that was actually before I owned it, which is funny. Now it's my book, and it's neat to have. So it's your run-of-the-mill children's stories about good and naughty children, what sort of trouble they get into, how they face consequences for their bad actions, and how they can improve. But in true 19th century style, some of the consequences are the child dies or something really sort of morbid that happens. But it's amusing to sort of read children's books from the past and see how heavy they can get. There are so many stories about children misbehaving with matches and burning their houses down with themselves in it, and it's just like, ugh, can you imagine reading that story to a child today? I can only, boy, I can't imagine how, for example, my little niece would react if I was warning her about stuff with her own mortality. But that is just how they were back then. But not a lot written in the margins, not a lot of ownership marks. I did buy this for the binding. And for these nice little engravings, because they're sweet. But this would have been, a children's book at the time. A school child would have read this, and it may have even been like a prize book or something like that for doing well in school. But it's so pretty. It's such a fun book. And it's pretty in its contemporary way, as opposed to this thing here, which is, yeah, I'm just at a loss for words at it. So I think this is a good sort of note to end on, the differences between these. I love them both. I love them both for very different reasons. And all of my books are like that. I don't really collect for the text per se. I'm not going to be reading this French Bible or this little French book of moral stories. Actually, all three of these books are French. That's funny. I didn't mean to do that, but happy French bookshelf tour day, I guess. And so I will see you next time for more bookshelf tour. Be sure to request any of these books you see behind me for me to talk about at a later date. I am still going to do a little, not necessarily bookshelf tour because I keep all of my reference books in a pile, but I'll talk through some of my book history reference books in a later episode. So I will see you next time, and have a lovely day.